Jake had been melting snow in his mouth for hydration. Now he let water pool before carefully dribbling it between the boy's lips. The child drank gratefully, tension leaving his small frame. Jake asked gently. The boy hesitated, wrestling with whether to trust this white stranger. Finally, in accented but clear English, Running Elk. That's a strong name. I'm Jake Morrison. You remember what happened? Running Elk's brow furrowed. Hunting. Party storm came fast. Horse spooked, fell off, could not find way back. How old are you, 13? Winters? Jake examined the boy's injured shoulders, swollen and tender, probably dislocated but not broken. Running Elk bore examination with stoic silence that impressed. Jake, why? Running Elk asked suddenly, studying Jake's face intently. Why? What? Why help me? Your people and mine. ... The implication was clear. Jake considered carefully. Because you needed help. Because you're just a kid lost in a blizzard. Because it was the right thing to do. Running Elk continued studying Jake's weathered features. Many of your people would not think so. Maybe not, Jake admitted. I'm not them. My wife taught me there's only one race that matters, the human race. They were quiet, listening to the storm. Jake felt Running Elk relaxing, natural wariness, giving way to exhaustion and recognition that this strange white man meant no harm. Your wife is gone? Running Elk asked eventually. 5 years now? Consumption took her? She was the best person I ever knew. She sounds like wise woman. She was. Would have liked you, I think. As hours passed, Jake found odd comfort in the boy's presence. Despite different backgrounds, despite racial tensions plaguing the frontier, they were simply two human beings, helping each other survive. Something pure transcended artificial divisions men created. Running Elk told Jake about his family, his father White Bear, a respected warrior, his mother Singing Bird, skilled with herbal medicines, his sister Little Fox, showing promise as a horsewoman. He spoke of his village in a protected valley 2 days east. Jake shared stories of range life, Sarah cattle drives in his small ranch near Cedar Ridge, where he raised cattle and tried making honest living. As dawn approached, Jake sensed change in the storm. Wind remained strong but no longer howling. Snow fell less heavily with occasional breaks showing stars. Storms breaking up, Jake observed. Running Elk nodded. My people will be looking for me. When storm passes, they will come. Chill, unrelated to weather. When Running Elk's people found them, what would they think of an old white cowboy who'd spent the night with one of their children? Would they see Jake as savior or a threat? Are you afraid? Running Elk asked. Reading Jake's expression, Jake considered honestly. A little. Your people have good reason not to trust mine. Makes for dangerous situations. My father is good man. Running Elk said, he will see what you have done. He will know you've saved my life. Jake hoped the boy was right, but couldn't shake feeling that morning might bring trouble. Still, he pushed worries aside. Whatever happened, Jake knew he'd made the right choice. Some things were more important than fear or politics. Sometimes, humanity demanded doing what was right, regardless of consequences. As first pale dawn light appeared, Jake Morrison held a young native boy close and waited to see what the new day would bring. The storm's fury had spent itself during the last hours before dawn, leaving behind a world transformed. As the first pale light of morning crept across the snow-covered plains, Jake carefully extracted himself from the shared blanket and peered out from their makeshift shelter. The landscape that greeted him was breathtaking in its stark beauty, endless. Rolling hills covered in pristine white snow that sparkled like crushed diamonds in the early sunlight. The silence was profound after the night's howling winds. Even Bessie stood quietly, her breath forming small clouds in the frigid air as she pawed at the snow, searching for any remnant of grass beneath. The world seemed frozen in crystal perfection, as if nature had decided to pause and admire its own handiwork. Jake's joints protested as he moved, stiff from hours of maintaining the same position to keep Running Elk warm. His back ached, His legs had gone numb, and his feet felt like blocks of ice in his boots. But he was alive, and more importantly, so was the boy. Running Elk stirred as the cold air hit him when Jake moved away. His dark eyes opened immediately, alert despite the ordeal he'd endured. Jake was impressed by the boy's resilience. Many grown men would still be struggling after such exposure to the elements. "How do you feel?" Jake asked quietly, his voice raspy from the cold and hours of conversation. "Better," Running Elk replied, sitting up slowly and testing his injured shoulder. He winced, but managed to move it more freely than the night before. "The cold, it is not so deep in my bones now." Jake nodded with satisfaction. The boy's color was much improved, no longer the alarming blue-white of hypothermia. His lips had returned to their natural color, and his movements, while still careful, showed returning strength. "We need to get moving," Jake said, beginning. "To pack up their meager camp? Get your blood flowing, warm you up properly." He glanced toward the east, where Running Elk had said his village lay. "And I suspect your people will be coming soon." As if summoned by his words, Bessie suddenly lifted her head, ears pricked forward in alert attention. Jake froze, following her gaze toward a low ridge about half a mile away. At first he saw nothing but snow-covered ground and scattered patches of scrub brush. Then, slowly, shapes began to emerge from the white landscape. Riders, many riders, Jake's heart began to pound as he counted the figures moving toward them across the snow. There had to be dozens of them, maybe more, spread out in a wide line that stretched across the ridge.
Yes.
As they drew closer, details became clearer. These were native warriors, mounted on sturdy horses, moving with the quiet efficiency of men, who had spent their lives trekking across difficult terrain. "Running Elk," Jake said softly, not taking his eyes off the approaching riders. "I think your people have found us." The boy struggled to his feet, using Jake's arm for support. His face broke into a smile when he saw the riders. He said with unmistakable relief and joy, "He leads them." Jake squinted against the morning glare reflecting off the snow. The lead rider was indeed impressive, a tall, broad-shouldered man on a magnificent black horse, riding with the bearing of a natural leader. Even at this distance, Jake could see the eagle feathers in his hair and the way the other warriors positioned themselves in respectful formation behind him. "That's good," Jake said, though his voice betrayed his nervousness. "That's real good." As the riders drew closer, Jake could make out more details. These were seasoned warriors, armed with rifles, bows, and traditional weapons. Their faces were painted for war, and their horses were decorated with symbols Jake didn't recognize, but assumed had significance to their tribe. The sight was both magnificent and terrifying. "I should explain," Jake began, but Running Elk placed a hand on his arm. "No need for words yet," the boy said quietly. "Let them see first. Let them understand what their eyes tell them." The warriors had spread out in a wide semicircle, effectively surrounding Jake and Running Elk's position. There was no possibility of escape, even if Jake had wanted to try. Bessie stood calmly beside him, as if sensing that sudden movements would be unwise. The lead rider, who Jake now assumed was White Bear, Running Elk's father, raised his hand, and the entire group came to a halt about 50 yards away. For a long moment, nobody moved. The silence stretched taut as a bowstring, filled with the weight of generations of mistrust and conflict. Then White Bear dismounted and began walking toward them, his rifle held casually but ready. He was a man in his 40s, Jake estimated, with a kind of weathered dignity that came from years of leadership and responsibility. His dark eyes never left Jake's face as he approached, measuring, evaluating, deciding. Jake fought every instinct that told him to reach for his gun. Instead, he stood very still, his hands visible and empty, trying to project calm confidence, despite the racing of his heart. Running Elk moved to stand beside him, though the boy still swayed slightly from weakness. "Father," Running Elk called out in his native tongue, his voice carrying clearly in the crisp morning air. What followed was a rapid exchange in their language, with Running Elk gesturing toward Jake and apparently explaining what had happened. Jake caught occasional English words mixed in: storm, cold, blanket, saved, but most of the conversation was beyond his understanding. White Bear's expression remained impassive as he listened to his son's account. But Jake thought he detected a subtle shift in the man's posture, a slight relaxation of the tension in his shoulders. When running, Elk finished speaking. White Bear studied Jake for a long moment before responding to his son in their native language. The wind howled across the Montana Territory like a banshee's wail, carrying death for any soul caught in its path. December 1876 brought one of the harshest winters the frontier had seen, and the blizzard raging across the plains showed no mercy. Before we begin, we'd like to ask you to tell us your name and the city you're watching from. We love getting to know our audience. Also, please don't forget to give this video a like, share it with others, and subscribe to our channel. That way we can keep bringing you more stories like this one. Jake Morrison pulled his hat lower, snow accumulating on the brim as his paint mare Bessie trudged through drifts, reaching past her fetlocks. At 62, Jake had survived more winters than most frontiermen, but this one tested even his seasoned endurance. "Easy, girl," he murmured, voice barely audible above the wind's roar. "We'll find shelter soon." But Jake knew these were words of hope, not certainty. Cedar Ridge lay 20 miles north, and the line shack he'd hoped to reach remained elusive in the whiteout. His fingers had long since lost feeling despite thick gloves. His patched wool coat fought the cold, but wind found every gap. The single woolen blanket behind his saddle was his lifeline, the difference between surviving the night and becoming another frontier casualty. He'd been heading to Cedar Ridge for a payment on cattle delivered before the snows, money for winter provisions, maybe a new coat. Now that seemed as distant as spring itself. Jake's mind wandered to Sarah, dead 5 years from consumption. "You'll catch your death out there." Jacob Morrison, she'd scold with loving eyes. She'd been right to worry. The landscape had become a white void. Familiar landmarks, the twisted cottonwood, Devil's Thumb Rock Formation, vanished beneath nature's frozen blanket. Jake relied on instinct and Bessie's sure footing to keep moving in what he hoped was the right direction. Bessie sensed something first. Her ears pricked forward, whinnying softly before the wind swallowed the sound. Jake felt her tension through the reins and peered ahead through driving snow. "What is it, girl?" Then he saw it, a dark shape beside old wagon trail remnants, barely visible beneath snow. Jake's heart lurched. A person, small and still, lying sideways in the snow, so covered in white he might have mistaken it for a fallen log without Bessie's alert behavior and the faint human outline. Jake dismounted quickly, boots sinking deep with a muffled crunch. Cold hit immediately, more intense without Bessie's shelter. He approached cautiously. Frontier life taught that apparent tragedy could mask danger. Kneeling, Jake brushed snow away with gloved hands. What he revealed caught his breath. A Native American boy, perhaps 13, lips blue, dark, skin ashen with cold. But Jake could see faint chest movement. Alive barely. The boy wore traditional buckskin clothing, well made, but insufficient against the brutal blizzard. Long black hair frozen with ice crystals, moccasin-clad feet nearly white with frostbite. Couldn't have been here much longer. Or he'd be beyond help. Jake's mind raced. Taking in a native boy was dangerous beyond measure. Indian wars were at their peak, tensions higher than ever following Custer's defeat at Little Bighorn months earlier. Every white settler suspected, every native person. If found with this boy, many would assume the worst, that Jake was a sympathizer, a traitor. But looking at the child's peaceful face, Jake saw only a human being in desperate need. The boy couldn't be much older than his nephew in Kansas. Politics and prejudice seemed insignificant, facing a child freezing to death. "Well, Bessie," Jake said aloud, breath forming white clouds, "looks like we've got ourselves a situation." The mare snorted, understanding their discovery's gravity. Jake had to act quickly. Hypothermia was setting in. Every minute counted. Storm showed no signs of abating, and shelter was crucial not just for his survival, but for the boys' life. 50 yards off trail, Jake spotted rocks and scrub brush providing windbreak. Not much, but it would have to do. He couldn't risk moving the boy far, and they needed wind protection to survive the night. Gently scooping the boy up, Jake felt how light he was, probably weakened by exposure and hunger. The child's body felt like ice through his clothes as Jake carried him toward makeshift shelter. When fighting every step, by the time they reached the rocky outcropping, both were covered in fresh snow. But rocks provided relief from the worst. Wind and Jake quickly created what shelter he could, using rope. Jake strung his tarp between larger rocks, creating a lean-to that would keep snow off them. Crude, but the best he could manage. Bessie positioned herself as additional windbreak, her bulk creating a small pocket of relative calm. Jake placed the boy on the driest spot and immediately began revival efforts. Experience taught him slow, gradual warming was key. Too fast could cause shock. He rubbed the child's hands and feet, trying to restore circulation while fighting his own body's demands for warmth. The hardest decision came next. His blanket. The heavy wool that was his shield against deadly cold would have to be shared. In these conditions, giving up even a portion of his only protection could mean death. But seeing the boy's blue lips and uncontrollable shivering, Jake knew there was no choice. "Sarah always said I was too stubborn to die easy," he muttered, unfurling the blanket. "Guess we're about to find out if she was right," with Frencherborn. Efficiency, Jake wrapped both himself and the boy in the blanket, pulling the child close to share what body heat remained. The boy felt like ice against him, but Jake held firm, knowing his warmth might be the only thing between this child and death. As wind howled around their meager shelter and snow piled higher, Jake Morrison settled in for what might be the longest night of his life. In his arms, a native boy he'd never met fought for life while somewhere in the distance. Unknown to both, eyes watched and waited in the swirling snow. Hours crawled by as Jake held the unconscious boy, sharing precious warmth through his old wool blanket. Outside their shelter, the blizzard raged with unrelenting fury, wind shrieking across the frozen landscape. Snow fell in thick flakes that hissed against Jake's makeshift tarp. Jake felt the boy's heartbeat against his ribs, weak but steady, a fragile rhythm of young life clinging to existence. The child's breathing was shallow and irregular, sometimes stopping for terrifying seconds before resuming with shuddering gasps. "Come on, son," Jake whispered hoarsely. "Don't give up on me now." He rubbed the boy's back through the blanket, firm enough to encourage circulation. The child's body temperature seemed slowly rising. They weren't safe yet. As night deepened, Jake talked to the boy, partly to stay awake, but also sensing that human voice might draw the child back from unconsciousness. "You know, I had a horse once that carried himself like you, proud, dignified, like he knew something the rest of us didn't. Called him Chief, though my Sarah said that wasn't respectful." Jake paused, listening to the wind. She was probably right, like she was about most things. The boy stirred slightly at Jake's voice, and the old cowboy took it as encouragement. He continued talking, finding odd comfort despite their dire circumstances. "I've been riding these plains 30 years, seen my share of trouble between your people and mine. Most of it unnecessary men being afraid of what they don't understand. Fighting over land that doesn't really belong to any of us." Jake shifted position, maintaining maximum warmth for both. "My Sarah had opinions about that, said people were people, no matter their skin color or language. Judge a man by his actions, not appearance, she'd tell me. She was wise, smarter than an old cowpoke like me deserved." Around midnight, the boy began shivering more violently. Jake initially worried, then realized shivering meant the boy's body was generating heat, survival instincts kicking in. Jake held him closer. "That's it," Jake encouraged. "Fight back. Don't let this cold win." Gradually, shivering became more rhythmic. The boy's breathing deepened and steadied. Jake felt continuing temperature rise and allowed himself small hope. Around 2 in the morning, the boy spoke. "Water," came a barely audible whisper. Jake's heart leaped. "You're awake. How do you feel, son?" Dark brown eyes fluttered open, filled with confusion and fear. Seeing Jake's weathered face so close, the boy tensed, but was too weak to resist. "Easy there, Jake," said calmly. "You're safe. I found you in the snow, near frozen. You've been unconscious for hours." The boy stared warily, quickly assessing threat. In circumstance, someone raised to constant awareness of danger. "My father asks why you helped me," Running Elk translated. "He wants to hear it from you." Jake cleared his throat, acutely aware that his next words might determine whether he lived or died. "Tell your father that I helped you because you needed help, because you're his son, and I could see he loves you, because it was the right thing to do." Running Elk translated Jake's words, and White Bear nodded slowly. He said something else, and Running Elk smiled slightly before turning back to Jake. "He says that is what he hoped you would say. He says a man's character is shown not by his words, but by his actions when no one is watching." White Bear stepped closer and extended his hand toward Jake. The gesture was so unexpected that Jake hesitated for a moment before reaching out to clasp the offered hand. White Bear's grip was firm and warm, and when their eyes met, Jake saw not the hostility he'd feared, but a deep, genuine gratitude. "Thank you," White Bear said, in clear, accented English. "You saved my son's life. Any father would have done." "The same," Jake replied, meaning every word. White Bear nodded thoughtfully. "Perhaps. But you are not his father. You owe us nothing. You've shared your blanket, your warmth, your protection. This is not a small thing." Behind White Bear, Jake could see the other warriors had dismounted and were moving closer. Rather than the threatening advance he'd expected, their approach seemed more curious than hostile. Several of them were studying Jake with expressions that seemed to mix surprise with something approaching respect. "Running Elk tells me you spoke with him through the night," White Bear continued. "That you told him stories of your wife, your life. This, too, is not a small thing to treat a scared boy with kindness, to ease his fear with gentle words." Jake felt his throat tighten with emotion he hadn't expected. "He's a good boy, brave, smart. You should be proud." "I am proud," White Bear said simply. "But today, I am also grateful." What happened next took Jake's breath away. White Bear turned toward his warriors and spoke in a voice that carried clearly across the snow. At his words, every single warrior, Jake counted them now, and saw there were indeed close to 300, moved as one. In perfect unison, they lowered their weapons, placed their right hands over their hearts, and bowed their heads in the gesture of profound respect. The sight was overwhelming. These proud warriors, these fierce defenders of their people and their way of life, were honoring an old cowboy who had simply done what seemed right. Jake felt tears threaten to fill his eyes and had to blink rapidly to maintain his composure. "This is our highest honor," White Bear explained, his own voice thick with emotion. "It is given only to those who have shown great courage, great compassion, great wisdom. Today, you are not a white man or a cowboy or a stranger. Today, you are a brother." Running Elk was beaming with pride as he watched his people honor the man who had saved his life. "I told you my father was a good man," he said to Jake. "I told you he would see." Jake found his voice with difficulty. I don't know what to say." "Say nothing," White Bear advised. "Some things are beyond words. Some things can only be felt here." He placed his hand over his heart again. The warriors maintained their respectful pose for what felt like an eternity before White Bear nodded, and they straightened as one. But the atmosphere had changed completely. Where there had been tension and potential danger, now there was something approaching warmth, despite the frigid morning air. "You will come with us," White Bear said, though it was clearly an invitation, rather than a command. "You will be welcomed in our village, honored as a friend. Running Elk's mother will want to thank you herself. Our medicine man will want to ensure that neither of you suffered lasting harm from the cold." Jake was overwhelmed by the generosity of the offer, but he also knew the practical difficulties it would create. "That's very kind, but I'm not sure it would be wise. If word got out that I'd been in your village, there are those among my people who wouldn't understand. They might use it as an excuse to cause trouble for your tribe." White Bear's expression darkened slightly. "Yes, there are always those who choose hatred over understanding, fear over friendship. Among your people and among mine." He paused, considering. "But perhaps there is another way." "What do you mean?" Jake asked. White Bear smiled, and Jake caught a glimpse of the man's wisdom and political acuity. There is a trading post, run by a man named Samuel Baker, halfway between here and your town of Cedar Ridge. Do you know it? Jake nodded. Sam's place. Good man. Treats everyone fair. Yes. Sam Baker has been a friend to our people for many years. If you were to meet us there tomorrow at midday, it would appear as a chance encounter to any who might observe. You could share a meal with us, allow our medicine man to check you for frostbite, receive the thanks you deserve without creating suspicion or danger. It was a thoughtful solution, and Jake found himself nodding. That sounds good. I'd like to meet Running Elk's mother, make sure she knows her boy is safe. And I would like to hear more stories of your wife, Running Elk added with a shy smile. She sounds like she was very wise. She was, Jake agreed, his heart warming despite the cold. She would have loved this moment. She always believed that people could find common ground if they just took the time to see each other as human beings instead of enemies. White Bear nodded approvingly. Your wife was indeed wise. Perhaps that wisdom lives on in you. As the sun climbed higher in the sky, warming the air slightly and making the snow sparkle even more brilliantly, Jake found himself surrounded by men who, just hours before, he might have considered enemies. Now they were sharing water, checking on Running Elk's condition, and discussing the best route back to their respective homes. One of the warriors approached, leading a beautiful spotted pony, speaking to White Bear in their native tongue. White Bear listened and nodded before turning to Jake. Swift Cloud here says that Running Elk should not ride alone, not after his ordeal. He offers to let you ride his second horse part of the way, to ensure the boy reaches home safely. Was touched by the offer, but shook his head. That's generous. But Bessie and I will be fine heading back to Cedar Ridge, and Running Elk looks strong enough to make it home with his people watching over him. I am strong enough, Running Elk confirmed, though Jake could see the boy was still favoring his injured shoulder. But I hope to see you again tomorrow, at the trading post. We'll be there. As the warriors prepared to depart, White Bear approached Jake one final time. Before we part, I want you to know something. What you did last night, sharing your blanket with my son, it will be remembered. Not just by our family, but by our entire tribe. Stories will be told of the cowboy who chose compassion over fear, who risked his own life to save a native child. These stories will be passed down to our children and our children's children. Jake felt humbled by the weight of White Bear's words. I hope they remember it as the night to peoples found a way to see past their differences. They will, White Bear assured him, because that is exactly what it was. As Jake watched the warriors mount their horses and form up for the journey home, Running Elk rode close to Bessie one last time. Thank you, Jake Morrison, the boy said formally, for my life, for your kindness, for showing me that there are good men among all peoples. Thank you too, Running Elk, Jake replied, for reminding me that courage and wisdom can come in any package, even that of a 13-year-old boy lost in a snowstorm. With that, the warriors rode away, moving like ghosts across the white landscape. Jake watched until they crested a distant ridge and disappeared from view, leaving him alone with Bessie and the memory of one of the most extraordinary mornings of his life. As he saddled Bessie and prepared for his own journey home, Jake reflected on the events of the past 12 hours. He'd started yesterday as a lone cowboy heading to town for payment, thinking only of getting through another harsh winter. Now, he was riding home with a story that would indeed be remembered for generations, a story of how a single act of human kindness had bridged the gap between two worlds that too often saw each other as enemies. The sun was fully up now, warming his face and beginning the slow process of melting the snow. Spring still seemed impossibly far away, but for the first time in months, Jake Morrison felt truly warm. Samuel Baker's trading post sat in a small valley where Willow Creek meandered through cottonwood and pine stands, creating a natural frontier oasis. Built of sturdy logs and stone with a wide porch and smoking chimney, Baker's place had served over a decade as neutral ground where all peoples could trade without fear. Jake arrived early and found Sam splitting firewood behind the building. Sam was a bear of a man in his 50s, with graying hair and hands speaking of lifetime hard work. Seeing Jake approach, his weathered face broke into a grin. Jake Morrison. You old cuss, heard you got caught in that blizzard? Figured you might be frozen solid somewhere. Came close, Jake admitted, dismounting and leading Bessie to the hitching post. Closer than I care to think about. You look none the worse for. Where, Sam observed, studying Jake's face, though I detect a story in them eyes. Come inside. Coffee's hot, and Maria just pulled fresh biscuits from the oven. Maria Baker, Sam's Mexican wife, greeted Jake with a hug and immediately began fussing over him, checking for frostbite signs while pressing steaming coffee into his hands. Samuel told me about the storm, she said in her musical accent. We were so worried about travelers caught in the cold. You're blessed to be alive, mi amigo. More blessed than you know, Jake replied, accepting biscuits and bacon. That's what's... This story I see brewing? Sam asked, settling across from Jake. And don't tell me it's just about surviving a blizzard. Before Jake could answer, approaching horses drew their attention. Through the front window, they saw riders emerging from the tree line, White Bear and about a dozen warriors. With Running Elk riding proudly among them, Sam raised an eyebrow. Well now, that's interesting timing. White Bear doesn't usually come calling in winter unless something significant has happened. Jake set down his coffee cup, heart racing with nervous excitement. Sam, I need you to trust me. What's about to happen might seem strange, but it's good. Better than good. Sam studied Jake's face, then nodded slowly. I trust you, Jake. Always have. The riders approached with dignity and purpose, stopping in the clearing before the main building. White Bear dismounted first, followed by his warriors, and Running Elk. The boy looked remarkably recovered. Sitting straighter and showing little sign of his injured shoulder, Jake stepped onto the porch. With Sam and Maria close behind, White Bear approached with measured dignity, but this time, his expression held warmth rather than wariness. Jake Morrison, White Bear said formally, loud enough for all to hear. We meet again, White Bear. Jake replied with equal formality. It's good to see you and Running Elk looking so well. Sam stepped forward, clearly puzzled but intrigued. White Bear, my friend, this is unexpected but welcome. What brings you to my trading post on such a cold day? White Bear smiled, and Jake could see the carefully planned nature of what was unfolding. We come to honor a debt, Samuel Baker. A debt that can only be repaid with gratitude and respect. Running Elk dismounted and walked to stand beside his father. The boy looked directly at Jake and spoke in clear, carrying voice. 2 nights ago, when the great storm raged across the land, I was lost and dying in the snow. This man, Jake Morrison, found me near death and shared his blanket, his warmth, his protection through the long night. He saved my life. Sam Baker's eyes widened as he looked between Jake and Running Elk, understanding dawning. Maria crossed herself and murmured a prayer in Spanish. But that is not all, White Bear continued. He could have simply given shelter and waited for rescue. Instead, he spoke with me through the night, telling stories, treating me not as an enemy or stranger, but as a person worthy of kindness and respect.
Owie.
Jake felt his cheeks warming with embarrassment. Anyone would have done the same, he said. Quietly, no, White Bear said firmly. Many would not have. Many of your people and many of mine would have seen an enemy where you saw a child in need. You chose differently. One of the warriors stepped forward, carrying something wrapped in beautiful beadwork. White Bear took it and turned to Jake. This morning, when we found you with our son, our warriors paid you the highest honor our people can give. Now, we offer you this. He unwrapped the bundle to reveal a magnificent blanket-thick, warm wool, decorated with intricate beadwork. In patterns that seemed to tell a story, this was made by Running Elk's mother, Singing Bird, and his grandmother. It is a replacement for the blanket you shared, but more than that, it is a symbol. Jake stared at the beautiful blanket, overwhelmed by the generosity. I can't accept something so valuable. The work alone must have taken months. Began it yesterday, White Bear said, smiling at Jake's surprise. All the women of our village worked through the day and into the night to complete it. Each bead, each thread carries their gratitude and prayers for your well-being. Running Elk stepped forward. The pattern tells a story, he explained, pointing to various beadwork sections. Here is the storm. Here is the moment you found me. Here is the warmth of your blanket surrounding us both. He pointed to a section where white and colored beads mingled in complex patterns. Here is the bridge between our peoples, built on kindness and courage. Jake accepted the blanket with trembling hands, feeling the weight of more than just wool and beadwork. He was holding a piece of history, a tangible symbol of the moment when two cultures had reached across the divide separating them. As the afternoon progressed, what had begun as formal meeting evolved into something unprecedented. Sam Baker, recognizing the historic nature of the moment, brought out his best food and drink. The warriors, initially standing in formal positions, gradually relaxed and began to mingle. Jake found himself in conversation with several warriors, including Swift Cloud, who had offered his horse that morning. Through a mixture of English, sign language, and occasional translation by Running Elk, they discussed ranching, hunting, the harsh winter, and shared frontier experiences. You know, Sam Baker observed to Jake during a quiet moment, I've been trying to build bridges between communities for over 10 years at this trading post. What you did in one night of sharing a blanket has accomplished more than all my efforts combined. Jake shook his head. It wasn't calculated, Sam. It was just ... human. Maybe that's exactly why it worked, Sam replied thoughtfully, as the sun began to set, painting the snow-covered landscape in gold and pink shades. White Bear approached Jake once more. We must return to our village before dark, he said. But before we part, I want to give you something else. He reached into his shirt and pulled out a small leather pouch, tied with sinew and decorated with a single eagle feather. This contains sacred tobacco and sage, blessed by our medicine man. If you ever have need of our help, if you are ever in danger or trouble, burn this and we will know. We will come. Jake accepted the pouch with the gravity it deserved. And if you or your people ever need help from me, you know where to find me? This I know, White Bear said. But more than that, I know that what happened between you and my son has created something new on this frontier. Others will hear this story. Others will begin to see that our peoples need not be enemies. Running. Elk approached for a final farewell. I will not forget what you taught me, he told Jake solemnly. What did I teach you? Jake asked, curious. That courage is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to do what is right despite fear. That kindness is stronger than hatred. That one person's actions can change the world. Jake felt his throat tighten with emotion. And you taught me something too, son. You reminded me that hope and wisdom can be found in the most unexpected places, even in the middle of a blizzard. As the warriors prepared to mount horses for the journey home, White Bear made one final gesture. He stepped to the clearing's center and raised his voice so all could hear. Let it be known among all peoples that Jake Morrison, the cowboy who shared his blanket, is a friend to the people of White Bear. Let it be known that he showed honor, courage, and compassion when tested by hardship. Let it be known that he built a bridge between our worlds with his actions. The warriors responded with a chant in their native language, voices rising and falling in harmonious waves that seemed to echo off surrounding hills. Then, with the same dignity with which they had arrived, they mounted their horses and rode away into the gathering dusk. Jake watched until the last rider disappeared over the ridge, then looked down at the blanket in his hands and the sacred pouch White Bear had given him. Sam and Maria stood beside him in companionable silence, all seeming to understand they had witnessed something extraordinary as winter slowly gave way to spring over the following months. The story of Jake Morrison and Running Elk did indeed spread. It was told around campfires and in saloons in native villages and frontier towns. Some dismissed it as sentimentality, but others found in it a spark of hope. There were no dramatic overnight changes. The Indian wars continued, prejudice remained, and the frontier stayed dangerous. But in small ways, in individual moments of choice, some people remembered the story of an old cowboy who shared his blanket with a freezing boy. Some chose compassion over fear, understanding over hatred, and on cold winter nights, when wind howled across the plains, Jake Morrison would wrap himself in the beautiful blanket that Singing Bird had made for him. As its warmth surrounded him, he would remember Running Elk's courage, White Bear's dignity, and the moment when 300 warriors had honored a simple act of human kindness. The blanket that had saved Running Elk's life had become something more, a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the harshest winters, human warmth could prevail. And the bridge it had built between two worlds continued to stand against the storms that raged around it. Proof that sometimes the smallest acts of courage could echo across generations.